Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're so glad you could join us. I'm Ellen. I'm part of the team here at Navigate, and I'll be your tech support person during the session today. Before we jump in, I'll quickly run through a few housekeeping items. I'll just let everyone know that the session is being recorded. We'll ask everyone to please keep your mics muted and cameras off during the presentation to keep background noise and distractions to a minimum. If at any point during the session you run into technical problems, please feel free to send me a direct message in the chat and I'll be happy to help you out. If you have a question during the presentation, you can send it in the chat at any point. We will have some time for a conversation at the end of the presentation and we'll cover any questions from the chat at that point. If you'd like to join the conversation, please use the reaction function at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute your mic. And now I'll hand things over to Maureen.
Thank you, Ellen. Hi and welcome. We're very excited to be starting this conversation today. My name's Maureen and I'm the co-founder of Navigate Food Safety with my partner, Alex Hanley, whom some of you may already know. What we're shooting for today is a conversation around the challenges that exist between the audit process and making safe food at the facility. It's a big topic and sometimes it's a sensitive one. We've heard from many people over the years and everyone has experienced some form of an unfair audit. So rest assured, you're not alone and you're in good company. We really want to create a safe place to talk openly about what is really going on, because if we can't name it, it's hard to fix it and you can't get anyone to acknowledge it. So Alex has some thoughts from our perspective and we hope many of you will share your thoughts and perspectives with us as well. Let me preface Alex's presentation with this. This isn't a new topic for us, and we didn't just hit upon it as an idea to stir the present day pot. Alex spent 12 years as an auditor. He then moved on to consulting and building solutions, and we've managed to convince quite a few people to join us in the Navigate movement between then and now. So we've been talking about this for about 10 years and we've brought this conversation to all levels of where we work in the industry, from the plant to corporate to the GFSI level. And that's a long story for another day. So for now, I'll turn things over to you, Alex.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm not going to keep you waiting. I'm going to tell you right away what my thought is on the question that brought us here today. Are fair audits a pipe dream? Well, I've seen too many fair audits to know for sure that they don't have to be a pipe dream. It is possible to be fair during audits. At the same time, I've seen an awful lot of audits that are or that were unfair to such a degree that I understand why a lot of people would think that fairness and audits are incompatible, that getting consistently fair audits is a pipe dream. Now, those are pretty bold statements. So let me give you a bit of background of where I'm coming from when I say that. So at Navigate, we've been taking an active approach at making changes in the certification industry with all levels of stakeholders for many years. We have ongoing conversations with auditors, with certification bodies, with certification program owners, with the GFSI even, and of course, we also have conversations going on with manufacturers, both at the plant level and at corporate level. And we're coming at it from a very practical standpoint. As Maureen mentioned, I spent many years auditing, so we know that work in and out. And we work closely with stakeholders in the certification industry, so we understand their challenges too. And we have been working closely with food manufacturers and making programs work for them, rather than programs work for the auditors. So we understand the needs from the food industry's perspective as well. At the same time, Navigate stays outside of those two industries. We don't make food and we are not part of the certification process. We're observers. So this gives us a very unique perspective, a very different point of view. And that's what I'd like to share with you today. Now, the key to make audits fair and to regain your power is to start looking at certification bodies and start looking at auditors as suppliers of services. And just like any supplier of service, you need to manage them. just like you would do with a maintenance contractor or a uniform company or your pest control company. You don't call the plumber and say, the door is wide open, do your thing, tell me what I need. You decide where you want to put that sink because you're a professional and so you know what I need. We never trust people blindly that way. So why would we do that with the certification industry? Why do we do that with auditors? Well, do you know what I think? I think we're so addicted to those certificates, it's all we can think of. The certificate is so important, we're willing to do absolutely anything. We're willing to put up with the most atrocious behavior in order to get it. Now, putting up with unfair audits is the least of our concern if all we care for is the certificate. Now, I'm not dismissing the importance of the certificate. You know, that certificate opens all kinds of doors. It's vital to access market. It's vital for suppliers to trust, or for manufacturers to trust their suppliers. So it's very important. But there's nothing wrong with wanting a certificate and wanting a bit more than the certificate. And we're here today to see how to make that happen. So first, we're going to look at the problem. We're going to look at 5 types of evidence supporting the notion that audits are unfair. And at the same time, we're going to look at the scope of the problem. And there's 2 reasons to do that. One is that I will argue it's a big problem. It's a global problem. It affects everybody in the industry. And the other reason I will argue is because there's a bit of a taboo about the whole thing. And it's time to stop that taboo. The topic needs to come front burner. We need to look at the problem and name it if we want a chance to resolve it. Now, that's the first section. We're not only going to look at the problem and how we got there, but we're also going to look at practically how to move forward. There's a lot of things that we can do right now, and you're most definitely not powerless. So we don't need to fix the industry, the whole industry at once. There are simple actions that we can start taking one plant at a time, one company at a time. And so we'll look at a few things you can do before the audit, during the audit, and after the audit. And then once that's done, we plan a bit of time afterwards for a discussion because we'd like to hear your impressions. We want to hear your questions, your reactions. What do you think of all that? I'm sure I'm not the only person with an opinion on this topic, so we want to hear yours. But first, let's look at what's in front of us. So we'll look at 5 levels of observation supporting the idea that we need to shift our attention to audit fairness. I could talk about examples all day of unfair situations that I have seen. Every time I read a report, every time I see a number of nonconformances that are invalid. Nitpicking, nonconformances that are out of scope, nonconformances so poorly written it doesn't make any sense. I'm sure you see the same thing. Every time I sit during an audit, I see some behaviors that don't meet expectations. Maybe the auditor is being unrealistic. Maybe the auditor is dismissing evidence because it's not presenting exactly the way they want to see it. Maybe they're wasting time, they're losing their cool, all kinds of stuff. Now, I've become very sensitive over the years with auditor behavior because I've paid a lot of attention to it. So I can pinpoint very quickly when things are sliding in the wrong direction. I might be very, very sensitive. However, I'm sure a lot of you are seeing the same thing all the time. And I say that because I've talked with a lot of people over the years, and I've never met anyone who hadn't experienced the same kind of situation. The idea that audits are very unpleasant is pretty much universal, as far as I can tell. But just to make sure, again, I don't want to assume, we're going to ask, there's going to be a few surveys going on during the presentation, and there's going to be a little pop-up that comes up, and you can just click on that to tell us your experience. And we'll look at those a little bit later. So a lot of people haven't spent as much time as I have thinking about it and putting names on the different situations. So the way they express it is very different. And here's one story. One day at the end of an audit, I was the auditor in that one. The plant manager told me that he was very surprised because he had never imagined an audit did not have to be unpleasant. Now, that was a compliment, of course. I hadn't been easy on them, but I had been fair, and he had appreciated that. What that person was saying at the same time was that all he had ever known were unpleasant audits, which is quite sad when you think of it, because unpleasantness doesn't add any value to an audit. It doesn't make the audit any better. It's just plain unfair. But let me tell you another story, the story of one of our friends, Arden, and how he expresses his discontent. So Arden's a quality manager. I've been working with Arden for many years, for more than 20 years, actually. I first audited the plant more than 20 years ago. And then later on, I worked with the team as a coach. So after all these years, we're pretty transparent with each other. The way Arden expresses his discontent with auditors is he says they make his blood boil. So I always think of a graph, I always think of a graph like this here, with Arden's blood temperature going up and down depending on his interactions with the auditor. You know, when Arden says that his blood boil, he's obviously talking metaphorically. What he's really saying is that the auditor upsets him big time, that he's very unhappy about the way he's treated. And so every time there's a spike here, every time his blood boils, it's because of a specific situation. There's something that's happening here and something that's happening here. So it could be, for example, right here, that the auditor is insisting to see a specific word on a document. You know, there's a program, the program works, everybody knows what to do, the records are there to prove it, the risk is controlled, the document has been the same for 10 years, it's always been acceptable, but this new auditor here insists there's a keyword missing on the document and they just won't let it go. They're like a dog with a bone. And then Arden's blood temperature just go up. And maybe over here, it could be that the auditor is making a big deal of a situation that is completely insignificant. You know, rookie auditor, something happens every day, but that new auditor doesn't understand that there's no consequence to it. That the way the auditor sees it and thinks it's a big deal, and it really doesn't matter what everybody else say or think, the auditor's opinion trumps it all. So most of the time, what infuriates people is when they feel that their programs or their people are not being respected. And those are two examples where the people and the programs are not being respected. Because you work really hard to keep good people and you work really hard to maintain good programs. So it's not fun when they're being dismissed. On this note, we have another little survey. You'll have to use the chat box for this one here because it's not a multiple choice. But what would make your blood boil during an audit? We'll look at a few of those answers a little bit later. Now, what I really like about this story about Arden is the way he expresses his discontent illustrates quite well something that I've noticed many, many times. Most people are upset during audits at some point or another, but they keep quiet. They keep quiet because they're afraid of auditors. And sometimes they don't even have the words to describe what's going on inside of them. They feel a big imbalance in power. They feel anger, but they also feel powerless. And that feeling of powerlessness just adds another layer to the specific situation, to the specific injustice that's going on at the time. And so they just live with it. They bottle their dissatisfaction, which is quite unfortunate. Okay. Next, we're going to look at certification as a system. So, we can look at anything as a system or as a process to see the big forces that are at play. And when we look at what's going on from a bird's eye view, we start seeing patterns. We start seeing, the reasons why things are the way they are. So when we look at certification as a system, we can see a lot of forces, like the ones I've already mentioned: power imbalance, the taboo, the lack of oversight on the job. So those are things we've talked about, but it's not just the auditor that's unfair to the plant. The certification body is also unfair to the auditors. I've been an auditor, I've been at the receiving end of those forces. So having to write a 50-page report, that's going, a report that's going to be nitpicked by a technical reviewer who has no idea what's going on during the audit, that has a huge impact on my work as an auditor and how I'm going to be doing that work. And then it doesn't stop here. as we said, we spend a lot of time with the certification stakeholders, so things happen at even higher level above the CB. So for example, the accreditation body who audits the certification bodies, well, they make things complicated, and all that rolls downhill to the plant. So maybe the technical reviewer that's reviewing the auditor's certificate or report is also going to, his work is going to be nitpicked by the accreditation body. So by nitpicking the auditor, they're just covering their backs. These here are just a few examples of what happens at the system level. The system is very complex. The point is we need to understand those forces if we want to resolve the issue. We need to bring fairness at the system level if we want to bring fairness at the plant level during your audits. Now, to maintain an abusive system, you need to crush dissent. That's just one of the basic principles of repressive systems. I think there's a repressive system going on. So a lot of people in power right now are denying that there's a problem in the first place, and that's reinforcing the problem. It seems like there's a pre-planned reaction when you bring the issue of fairness about certification. What they'll say is that the auditor is not a robot, that you have to consider the human factor, that you can't expect auditors to see everything, you know, that auditors are working on a sample basis, that things change every day in the plant. It seems like there's all kinds of pre-established answers to justify the fact that they're going to refuse to look at the situation that you're bringing, and that they're going to refuse to look at to address the behaviors that you're calling into question. Now, is that just me, or is anybody else experiencing the same thing? And then finally, when you look at the very big picture, when we look at the worldview, we see the Global Food Safety Initiative. And the Global Food Safety Initiative is very concerned with confidence in certification. It's their mission, it's their raison d'être. So they spend they take that very seriously. And in order to get confidence in certification, they're looking at audit consistency, because consistency is the #1 complaint in the industry. So they know they have to address that. And in order to get auditor consistency, they're looking right now at auditor certification. So the same way that manufacturing plants are certified nowadays, pretty soon auditors are going to be certified. And so they're looking at that, and the program is out. You can have a look at the program. Part of the program includes a competency program. So that's one part of the auditor certification program. And brace yourselves, that list of competencies is 13 pages long. So, that's pretty complicated. To make things a bit easier to digest, to make the whole thing a bit easier to work with, we looked at those same competencies and we organized them around 2 big topics. And of course, you guessed, those 2 topics are, one of them is fairness. Of course, we need audits that are thorough. We need audits that, when our suppliers are going through GFSI audits, we want to trust that the auditor is going to be thorough, because otherwise there's no point in looking at those certificates in the first place, or looking at those audit reports. But we also need to have fair audits, because nobody is going to respect a process that is unfair. So the point here is that fairness is a big deal. And this is the end of the first section of the presentation. We need to tie a few loose ends. We have some poll results, maybe.
Yep. So looking at our first poll on audit experiences, we had quite a few people submit their responses. 8% have never had a bad experience with auditors. 33% said that it happens rarely, the problem's marginal. We had almost 50%, we had 42% say bad auditor behavior is frequent during audits and it is a problem. And 17% said fair auditors are very hard to find. It's a very big problem. For our second poll, our open-ended question, what would make your blood boil during an audit? We had a few responses submitted. When they want to penalize you for a program that would not be useful to our plant, therefore not making the program work for you, but making it vice versa, which would defy the purpose. An auditor unable to separate personal preference from the standard they should be auditing against. Fixing too much on the past and not on the future. And an auditor who doesn't understand our specific product or process and they don't care to.
They don't care to, that's pretty...
Yeah, there's a couple in the chat here as well. I'll share really quickly.
Okay.
And auditors tell us what our policies and procedures are instead of listening to what we are trying to explain. And when auditors get into the false notion that they're regulators and don't realize the third-party voluntary certification scheme.
Well,
so those were some great responses.
Excellent, very good. Before moving on to the, so we'll have a chance to talk about all that at the end. That's very interesting, very similar to some of the things that we see. But I like the honesty of especially looking at the auditor and saying they don't care. We can see the same thing as also. So before moving on, we'll have a quick summary, quick recap. We looked at 5 types of evidence to support that audits are not fair. We looked at personal observations. We looked at stories that other people would tell us. We looked at the forces at play at the certification system level. We looked at the denial, the pre-recorded reaction to unfairness by the certification industry. Here, I should say, it's not everybody in the certification industry that is denying. There's just a healthy level of denial. And then we looked at the emphasis from the GFSI on auditor certification and how fairness could play a key role in that. So we've looked at that, and out of that, we can conclude a few things. First thing is we tend to look at only the bright side of audits, officially anyways. But in reality, some can be good, some can be bad, and usually there's a mixed bag of tricks there. Second, unfair audits, they're a big deal. There can be a lot of negative impacts on facilities and on food safety when audits are unfair, and we need to talk about that. Third, people are afraid of audits, and people are afraid of retaliation, and they're even afraid of talking about the fact that they're afraid. There's a taboo. And there's good reasons for their being afraid. Some fear. The certification industry as a whole is denying the problem, which feels like they're repressing dissent, and that reinforces the lack of fairness. And finally, we looked at fair and thorough as a means of bringing back confidence in the certification industry. Fairness could play a leading role in fixing the whole system, so it's a very big and very interesting topic. Now, that's a pretty bleak picture if you want, or it could be a pretty hopeful picture depending on how you look at it. The whole point about this first section was really to open up a conversation that we hope is just starting. But I know you all want to get practical things to do, so here we go. So we said the key to bringing back fairness is to look at the certification industry as suppliers of services. So the first thing you do with a supplier of service is you set expectation for them. But before you set expectations, you need to be clear on what you want out of the whole process, out of that relationship with that supplier. And don't tell me it's just a certificate, because that's probably the root cause or one of the root causes of the situation we're in right now. So we need to start looking at certification as bringing us a lot more than just a certificate. Right now, the average facility is getting a certificate, and they're also getting a ton of red tape and a big cleanup just before the audit. And they probably end up with programs that are more complex than they really need to make the auditor happy. And they probably have programs that are not aligned with reality, but that are aligned with the external standard instead. And that usually ends up with a lot of confusion and disengaged operators as unfortunate collateral. So it's not always the case, but it's often the case. The whole point is we need to be clear on what we want to get out of the certification, and it's a lot more than a certificate. It, at the very least, needs to be programs that support the work that you do in the facility and save food. Now, once you've identified your needs, then you need to define a spec. Now, most companies don't have a specification for certification services. You have one for your trash, the company that removes the trash, you have one for the pest control company, you have one for the uniforms, but you, like most companies, don't have a specification for certification services. And here we mean a lot more than just referring back to a certification program. It's not just saying, oh, I want a BRC, I want you to follow the BRC programs or the SQF programs or the FSSC 22000 program. It needs to be something that you can work to evaluate your certification body. Now, we could spend a lot of time defining organizational needs, and we could spend a lot of time looking at a specification, but we have to plow ahead, unfortunately. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you the specification that we use in our work with our customers, just so that you can start looking at what a spec for a CB looks like. And then, if there's interest, we can dig into that some other day. But as I said, right now we have to plow ahead. The other thing is you can start thinking about this question here, because we thought that would be a good icebreaker for the conversation at the end of the webinar. So what would you put on a specification for a CB? What is it that you want them to know? And really, we can relate that to the comments that were already made. That's a good start. Now, once you've defined a spec, then you need to have a conversation with the certification body to agree with them on the expectations. That's the whole point of a specification. And once that is done, then you need to communicate that same information to your team so that they know exactly what your expectations are and so that they can hold the auditor accountable. Now, once that's done, then you're going to train your team. And what are you going to train them on? Well, you're going to train them on what are acceptable behaviors and what are unacceptable behaviors. So the first thing is we need to define those behaviors. And then we need to give them names, because if we can't name them, then we can't talk about them between ourselves, So we need to develop a shared language about what fairness means during audits. And then we need to be able to recognize those behaviors. What are the symptoms, if you want, of an auditor abusing their authority? So let's say, for example, that you're debating the validity of a non-conformance. That happens during audits. The auditor thinks one thing, you think another thing, and then there's, a healthy conversation going on. Let's say that in this case, the auditor doesn't have a leg to stand on. They're not really capable of making a case for it. And then they say, well, we all know I could go back in the plant and find more stuff. Now, that's a very convenient way for an auditor to win a debate. They just show their teeth and the conversation is closed. Is that fair? Is that a fair behavior? Or would you call that a threat? Now, I most definitely would call that a threat. And because that's what a threat is. A threat is, if you don't do what I say, I will get nasty. And threatening is most definitely an example of abuse of authority. And that's what I mean by saying we need to recognize those behaviors. We need to be able to pinpoint exactly what are the simple things that we don't like or that are not acceptable, and be able to talk about them. Now, once we can name them and we can recognize them, we need to decide how we can handle those behaviors. So we'll look at a few examples. So we said we took the GFSI's 13 pages of competency and boiled it down to 2 words, but obviously there's a bit more detail to our program than those 2 words. There's a few layers, and if we look down one layer, we get these 8 buckets here. But really, we said we would focus on just the fairness side today. So we're going to look at 4 buckets. First, audits have to be based on evidence. They've got to be real as opposed to hypothetical. And that's a basic teaching in auditor training and lead auditor training. Things like, well, this could happen or that could happen, that has no place in a certification audit whatsoever. This is a big no-no. We have to work based on evidence and based on all the evidence that's presented, not just the one that's convenient for one party. Then everything has got to be filtered through a risk-based lens. Every deviation is not a non-conformance. We're not looking for total control. We are looking for controls that are appropriate to the likelihood and the severity of the hazard that we're looking at. And then auditing is a profession, and all the rules that apply to any professional anywhere in the world, all these rules apply to auditors. And then finally, because a lot of the checks and balances that are in place to control potential abuses in other professions, because those controls are not in place in the context of audits. So if you take just for example, the fact that the boss is almost never there to see the auditor do their job, because those controls are not in place, then the risk of abuse is astronomical. And therefore, we need to pay special attention to it. So we decided to make it one of the 4 categories. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at one thing that you can do to take your power back with each one of these 4 categories of competencies. So what does it mean to be fact-based? Would you think this this statement is fact-based? We found 3 uncontrolled documents. Now that could look like a non-conformance to an auditor. Now I realize there's a verb missing there. Let's just say there were 3 uncontrolled documents. Does that look like an appropriate statement? You know, I've seen that non-conformance written 100 times, and it might seem like a fair representation of what happens, because let's say we found 3 uncontrolled documents. You know, we could even have named those documents. We could have listed them just to add power to the statement. But what's missing here is that all the facts are not revealed in this non-conformance. The significance of the observation is not included. The way it's written right now is very biased because it's showing only one point of view, the point of view of the auditor, who wants to justify that as being a non-conformance. How about this here? You know, there were 3 uncontrolled documents, true, but 200 documents were reviewed during the audit. Now, by rewriting the non-conformance, by including the perspective, we're removing the bias on the problem, and we're putting that observation in context. In a certain way, we're discrediting the significance of the finding. I mean, 3 out of 200, that's 1.5%, 98.5% compliance is not perfect, but it's not bad either. So the point here is that you have the power to tell the auditor, this is not fair. We didn't only see 3 uncontrolled documents, we saw 200 documents altogether. So that should be written in the non-conformance. So that's the first way to regain your power. Now, rewriting non-conformances, that works for when the auditor is not being realistic. It also works when the auditor is not being risk-based. So let's say there were some cracked tiles in production area. It's a deviation to the glass and brittle plastic policy or clause. It's a potential source of foreign material. What about if this was the case also? Let's say it was in the pasteurization room and the process is completely enclosed. Well, it's much harder to make a case for a non-conformance if the process is completely enclosed. So by rewriting the non-conformance, you're regaining your power. Acting unprofessionally is extremely easy. There's a million things one can do to be unprofessional. Playing with their phones, taking half-hour personal calls while everybody's waiting at the table. They're classic. We're not going to go through the list. We'd be here for a long time. But, you know, usually lacks of professionalisms don't cripple the audit. They're just annoying. So the easiest thing to do is just to make notes during the audit and give feedback to the CB afterwards. And finally, misusing authority. Well, the trick here is to be able to recognize early symptoms because we want to de-escalate those non-conformances, and or we want to de-escalate those situations as much as possible. If talking with the auditor doesn't work, you can always take a time out. You can always call the auditor's boss and say, talk to your agent. This is not acceptable behavior. And if they're not listening to your feedback, you can always walk an auditor out of the plan. They're a guest, and if they don't follow the rule, that has a huge impact on your programs, on your people, and on the safety of the product that you make. So if you can walk a maintenance contractor out of the plant because they drank a can of pop or they smoke a cigarette in the wrong place, you can most definitely walk an auditor out of the plant because they've lost their cool, they've or they were demeaning to your staff. Once that's all done, you can evaluate your auditor performance. You can use the 8 criteria that we showed you to start that. And then you can evaluate your certification body, and you can use the specification that you'll have to have a crack at that. And then you provide feedback to the CB, and they can provide the feedback to their own auditor. And if things are really went really out of hand, you can always provide feedback to the certification program. And that's the end of the second presentation. So maybe we can go to some more poll results.
Yep. So our last question we posed was whether or not people had a spec for their external audits and certification services. Of our responses, 20% said yes, they do have a spec. 40% said no, and the other 40 said, if we have one, I've never seen it.
Well, that is very, very interesting. And I would be very curious. I'd be very interested to see the specs. It's good. It's good to hear that some people are doing work on that front. We have a summary, like very quickly, 5 things we can do to start doing right now. We can clarify expectations, develop the specs, communicate that with the CB. You can train your team. You can start rewriting non-conformances. You can evaluate the auditors and the CB and provide feedback. I'm going quickly because I want to jump straight to the conversation.